All right, I think that is our cue to go. Welcome, everyone. I'm Dr. James Waller. I'm the Cohen Professor of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Keene State College in New Hampshire, which has a very, very different climate than what I'm experiencing here. So it is good to be with you. I'm also Director of Academic Programs here at the Auschwitz Institute for the Prevention of Genocide and Mass Atrocities. Today, we begin by acknowledging that this panel comes to you from the ancestral homelands of 22 different Native nations, and we're honored to be here on their land. Today's comparative panel is entitled Anti-Semitism, Hatred, and Bigotry. In a country divided by a ton of different isms, seemingly every day we add another ism that continues to divide us, anti-Semitism has unfortunately had a long and complex history with the US, and we still see significant manifestations today of prejudicial acts, discriminatory behaviors directed toward people of the Jewish faith or identify as Jewish. So fortunately today we have three panelists who it's my honor to introduce, who will help us think through many of the issues today facing us in terms of anti-Semitism, hatred, and bigotry. I'll introduce each of the three panelists now, and they will speak in the sequence in which they're introduced. I've asked each of them to do the impossible, which is share with us their remarks and thoughts in about 15 minutes or less. After that, we'll turn for a chance for the panelists to interact with each other on some of the thoughts that have been triggered from each other's comments, and then we'll open it up to questions and responses from you as well. The first of the three panelists and presenters is Dr. Ronette Bachmann from the University of Delaware. Dr. Bachmann's work as a statistician at the U.S. Department of Justice and is now a professor in the Department of Sociology and Criminal Justice at the University of Delaware. She's co-author of several books, including Statistical Methods for Criminology and Criminal Justice, The Practice of Research in Criminology and Criminal Justice, Violence, The Enduring Problem, Murder American Style, Explaining Criminals and Crime, Essays in Contemporary Criminal Theory, and Stress, Culture, and Aggression. In addition, she is the author of Death and Violence on the Reservation, along with many articles that examine the epidemiology and etiology of violence and victimization. Please join me in giving a hand of welcome to Dr. Bachmann. Second speaker on the panel will be Special Agent Daniel Johnson from the FBI Phoenix office. Special Agent Johnson investigates criminal civil rights violations for the FBI in Arizona. In that role, Special Agent Johnson investigates hate crimes, color of law violations, FACE Act violations, and international human rights violations, including genocide, torture, and war crimes. Please join me in welcoming Special Agent Johnson as well. And then finally, we have Dr. Joshua Shanes from the College of Charleston. Dr. Shanes is Associate Professor of Jewish Studies and Director of the Arnold Center for Israel Studies at the College of Charleston. He's published widely on modern Jewish politics, culture, and religion, as well as anti-Semitism and contemporary politics in both academic and popular outlets, including the Washington Post, Slate, Haaretz, and Tablet. He is currently writing a history of Jewish Orthodoxy from its German origins to the 21st century for the Keywords in Jewish Studies series at Rutgers University Press. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Shanes. Again, we'll have each of the speakers speak consecutively for about 15 minutes each. As you have questions, please jot them down. At the end of their remarks, they'll interact a bit, and then we'll open it up to questions from you. So, Dr. Bachmann.
I first want to thank the sponsors and the wonderful people that are here in the audience today. I mean, this has been a truly, I'm just honored to be here with all the people who are so interested in preventing this kind of violence and learning about it. And thank you, Dr. Waller, for giving me 15 minutes. I spent my night in the hotel last night cutting my slides in half, so I could meet within that 15-minute timeline. But I'm a numbers person, so I'm here to talk about what we know about hate crime and how we know it, because newspapers and media outlets talk about we have this many victims, we have that many victims, but it's a very complex thing, as you can imagine, actually trying to measure it. So wait a minute. Okay. We first need to say, what is a hate crime? And a hate crime is like any other crime. It can be a violent crime, it can be a property crime, but the difference is it's motivated by hate or bias in some way. And so here comes the problem. Yesterday we had a session on intent. That's hard to prove. So there are different ways we measure intent. Hate crime has always been sort of, at least in the last 50 years, illegal, starting with 1968 legislation. But these two murders, which I'm not going to go into the horrific details, really brought hate crime to the societal consciousness. The first of James Byrd Jr. in Jasper, Texas, and then soon thereafter of Matthew Shepard near Laramie, Wyoming. And these horrific murders sort of galvanized an outrage against violence based on bias of any kind. And hate crime legislation took a while to catch up to this horrific response to the society. It took, in 2009, the Matthew Byrd and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crimes Prevention Act, almost 10 years later, but nevertheless here. And we've had a few most recent hate crime legislations passed by Biden. One is the 2021 COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act, and the most recent, just about a week ago, the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, which took almost 200 failed attempts and 100 years to pass, but we're making progress. So what does the epidemiology of hate crime look like? And here's where measurement matters. It matters significantly. A lot of people talk about the FBI uniform crime reports now kind of transitioning to NIBR's data. This data is voluntarily reported by jurisdictions across the country to the FBI to compile these rates of victimization. This is great because it's a long-running series of statistics to monitor crime and violence, but the problem is, how many victimizations are actually reported to police? We know from survey data that less than half of violent victimizations are ever reported to police, and some offenses much less. So you're getting a very, very top of the pyramid look at the rates of prevalence rates. And also, what is not so known is that some jurisdictions don't even report to the FBI. Chicago, for example, hasn't reported their data to the FBI for years. The other Justice Department mechanism for measuring violence is the National Crime Victimization Survey, which after many, many years of thought, back in the late 60s, the Justice Department said, wow, there is a hidden amount of crime that we don't know anything about from these UCR police reports. We need to institute a survey, which they did back in 1972, and it's been revised many times ever since. But it is one of the largest representative samples of the US population. And it asks very behavior-specific questions to the sample survey respondents about victimizations they may have experienced, not in crime-specific lingo, like were you robbed, very behavior-specific lingo, were you pushed, grabbed, or shoved, or did somebody forcefully take something from you? And they have cues of family members and known offenders. So it's quite a great victimization survey. And they, in the last 8 years, started measuring, more than 8 years, I guess now, about 10 years, hate crimes. And so how do they measure it? If somebody reports one of their screening questions and says yes, they ask, do you perceive this to be motivated by hate or bias in any way? If so, what kind? And additionally, what was the evidence? Was there graffiti? Did they say something during the victimization? So they have sort of a high bar. The other way, particularly recently, with the influx of Asian American and Pacific Island hate crime increasing, people and organizations have been doing content analyses with papers that are populated in cities where high Asian American and Pacific Islander populations live. And so these incidents will frequently make it to the paper, but never be counted by either police reports or the survey. So this triage of measurement helps us get a better assessment of the type of crimes and how many. And look at the difference. This is the UCR police reports. The most recent data, 8,437 offenses, compared to the NCVS survey, almost 208,000 offenses. So an extremely different risk portrayal of hate crime victimizations across the two. This is the US Justice Department data sources. Now, fortunately, a lot of the epidemiology, that is the prevalence across groups, looks very similar across two surveys. Now, my students will tell you, Ronette hates pie charts. So forgive me, I really do dislike pie charts, but this one's pretty okay. It shows the type of bias and hate perpetrated by, that comprises these hate crime incidents from the NCVS, and it looks very similar to the FBI's. So you can see the primary motivation, and then I've created, this looks at over time how we do see hate crime victimizations are increasing. And this is only from 1 year to 2019 to 20, but it was increasing from 16, and we know the correlation there, which I'll talk about in a second. These are just the majority of bias cases within each major group: race, ethnicity, anti-Black, religious, anti-Jewish, and sexual orientation, anti-gay against males. The trends, as I highlighted, and this is from official US Justice Department data, but other groups are seeing tremendous increases. I'm going to talk first about anti-Semitic incidents. They remained at historic highs during 2020, and especially increases in certain states, including Ohio, and states you may not think of. This is mirrored not just in the United States, but around the world. As I was just talking over the break, when bad actors do bad things in a certain country, it echoes across the globe. So you see some of these countries had unbelievable increases in anti-Semitism across the world. Anti-Asian violence is on the rise. These are in, look at this, in 2020, and this is different cities, just spikes that are horrific. And I'm sure most of you have seen some of the things on news organizations and shows that show, based on camera footage, these horrible, just brutal attacks on Asian American and Pacific Islanders. Hate crimes against African American and Latinx populations also increasing. This Nicole Franklin admitted driving into a teen in 2019 because she appeared Mexican. And of course, the 2019 deadliest mass shooting of Latinx populations at a Walmart in El Paso, Texas. Now, I don't have time. How much time do I have? I don't even. 5 more minutes. Okay, wow, okay. There have been several sessions that talk about the factors related to this increase. And so, as Dr. Alvarez said yesterday, it's a multivariable reason. One reason, a backlash against the Black Lives Movement and the taking down of Confederate statues. The other is just the legitimation of prejudice and intolerance by leaders. And this tweet by our former president, whose name shall not be named, caused a spike of thousands of hate crimes against Asian American and Pacific Islanders. This woman is responsible for increasing and legitimating prejudice and intolerance against many subgroups, including the Jewish population. And of course, somebody that Tucker Carlson. We've talked a little bit in certain sessions about the great replacement theory. He actually espouses this on Fox News as a legitimate theory. In fact, some of the worst mass shooters in recent history espouse this great replacement theory, that through immigration and having children, the great white race is going to be replaced. So, along with these incidents, it's not surprising that there's been a very strong correlation in white nationalism groups. The Southern Poverty Law Center, which, by the way, is the only organization that I think validly tracks increases in this organized group membership, have seen increasingly numbers joining already existing organizations and increasing numbers of new organizations online. As we talked about also, this authoritarian resurgence isn't just happening here where our democracy is sliding, but across the globe as well. And again, I want to reiterate what Dr. Alvarez said yesterday. There's not one single cause. All of these factors go into the equation to predict what we see in this increased hatred and legitimation of it. What do I think? One of the things that I see good, I want to end, I don't know who you are, but you ask several times, what can you tell me that's hopeful about this? So I'm ending with what I think is hopeful. The federal government now and many states are making headway in prosecuting these horrible offenders. So these three men who basically ran down and killed a man in Georgia, not only were found guilty at the state level for murder, they were found guilty at the federal level for hate crimes. These sorts of things will hopefully act as deterrents for would-be offenders out there, hopefully. And as the ADL says, that's at the societal level, but at the individual level, we all need to speak up and share facts. Over the last few years, one of the things that I have done almost on a weekly basis is read empirical evidence on how to talk to people calmly about the facts. And that's what we all need to do. We can't engage in hyperbolic, angry responses to this. We need to be calm, listen, and reflect back. That's the only way we're going to combat, I believe, some of the trends we see. Thank you very much.
I'm just going to minimize that. What is that?
Good afternoon. My name is Dan Johnson. I'm taller than Dr. Bachman. First, I want to thank you for giving me the chance to come out and talk to you. Thank you for being here. I think this is a wonderfully important and an important topic and a timely, well, we find ourselves discussing it in a timely way here and now today. I've been investigating criminal civil rights violations for the FBI for the last 7 years here in Phoenix, which means I investigate hate crimes. Is that back? Yeah. Excellent. I'm just going to lean a little bit. Hate crimes, color law violations, which means someone acting with the authority of the state, willfully depriving others of their civil rights, FACE Act violations, which is the federally guaranteed access to abortion providing clinics, and international human rights violations. We have a workshop tomorrow that is going to delve into the details of what the FBI does in all these areas and the intricacies of the various statutes. So I'm not going to show you slides. I'm not going to read to you. I want to tell you some of the things in broad strokes that I think are important and relevant to a discussion now about genocide, division, and hate. I also want to thank everyone that's watching us online. This is an interesting time in our lives, a time in history when we can be so connected online that we can, as Ronette said, instantly feel the effects of what happened to others around the world. I work with the Jewish community here in Arizona on a daily basis. And I know that my friends in synagogues, Chabad houses, Jewish community centers around the state feel when people are taken hostage in Colleyville, when synagogues are threatened and attacked elsewhere. They don't imagine what it's like. They have a visceral reaction to it. They see this as an existential threat to them. I think that's reasonable. I can appreciate that. But I also want to let you know that this time when we're looking around the world and we're seeing increased hate, increased anti-Semitism, one of the reasons we see increased hate and increased anti-Semitism is because no one is suffering it in silence. They're not taking a threat to their people, to their community, to themselves, and holding it in quiet or in shame. They're letting other people know. And I can tell you, as a law enforcement professional, there is nothing more important to me than giving those people who are in a potentially victimized community that avenue by which they can make known the threats to them, the crimes committed against them, so that they don't have to suffer alone, in secret, or in shame. Dr. Waller has talked about genocide many, many times, and he's talked about it in a framework that I think is useful. It's a framework that I've been thinking about often recently as an upstream, midstream, and downstream problem. And it's very interesting to think about how we in law enforcement can affect genocide and where in that stream we can affect it. First, though, we have to think about genocide in two different sectors, internationally and domestically. Internationally, what can the FBI do about genocide? We don't have jurisdiction internationally. We do have federal statute that gives us the ability to prosecute Americans who go overseas to commit acts of genocide, war crimes, torture, etc. We also can use that statute to do the same for those who are from other nations, but after committing these acts, come to the United States. But beyond that, when you think about that, that's very downstream. What can we do upstream? What can we do to address division? Hate and the acts of hate, the incidents of hate, is very much symptomatic of division. What can we in the FBI do about that? We are not in the business of policing thoughts or policing beliefs, for which I'm very grateful. But speech speech at a certain point does become something which we can address. You say, wait, we have freedom of speech. We have 3 hate crime statutes that we'll talk about in more detail later, I'm sure, all of which will give us the ability to talk about speech, particularly threats. So 18 USC 245, 247, and 248. 245 is our oldest hate crime statute. It comes from the civil rights era. And while it has its cumbersome bits to it, it does give us the ability to address the use of force and the threat of force. Similarly, the Church Arson Prevention Act, 18 U.S.C. 247, gives us the ability to address force and threat of force. And finally, the FACE Act gives us, again, the ability to use our statutes to address force and threat of force. This is a very narrow thing, the threat of force. I talk to people on an almost daily basis who have felt threatened. They felt threatened by everything from their neighbors to the political climate. But feeling threatened is not the same as being threatened. I'll say it again. If you simply feel fear, you feel anxiety, it's not the same as being threatened. And the Supreme Court has said very clearly that for you to be threatened, it has to be a clear description of the intent to use force or violence against a person, an individual, or a group, with the goal of causing that person or group to feel fear for the safety of themselves. It doesn't mean, for example, political hyperbole. If I say that because of what's going on in the world today, I want to shoot you all online. The first question I ask as a law enforcement professional is, who is you all? We're not clearly making threats. I say all that because I want to be able to use our statutes to intervene upstream in an act of hate, which means that I have to know about threats, hopefully before they precede an act of violence. Very difficult for me to know if no one will tell me. I'm sure you can imagine. Which brings me then to the what can we all do portion. What we can all do, whether we're law enforcement or not, is we can attempt to expand our circles. We find, particularly in this time of pandemic and COVID, that we're living in smaller and smaller groups. We spend more and more of our time online. We interact less and less with strangers except through the internet, which is a fun, shouty place where people don't change their minds. But face to face, you can meet a person, you can connect with the person, you can get to know them, they can get to know you, be someone outside of your normal spheres of influence. Expand your circle. Share with them what makes you you, they can share with you what makes them special. I spend most of my time as an FBI agent talking to people about what our statutes allow, in the hopes that someone who experiences a crime of hate will let me know about it so that I can act on it. But my other hope is that the people I talk to will make their own connections. And with their own connections, they'll bring those people that they connect with to the FBI if they witness or become victim to an act of hate. That would give us then that chance to get upstream of hate crimes and intervene ahead of these acts that are so painful to the communities that are victim to them and so divisive to our nation. Wow. I look forward to the rest of this time. Look forward to the chance to talk with the panel and take questions when the time comes. Thank you.
Well, those are tough acts to follow. Let me pull this up. And slideshow from beginning. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about what is anti-Semitism, which we were talking about earlier this panel and throughout the week. And by the way, let me echo thanks for to Volker and the others for organizing this panel, this conference, which has been really remarkable. To do this, I collapsed a 4-month course into a 40-minute presentation, and then collapsed the 40-minute presentation into a 15-minute presentation. So I'm going to do the best I can. If anyone would like the full slideshow, I'm happy to share it. Just email me and I'm happy to give it to you. But I'll be going somewhat quickly through some of the pictures and certainly some of the text that I put together. I didn't cut it back like you did. I should have, but I was tired last night. The goals for the next 10 to 15 minutes is to talk a little bit about the myths of pre-modern and modern anti-Semitism. And here I'll go most quickly because I'm at least for our purposes interested in that right now. But I want to think about the relationship of anti-Semitism to race and racism, and as well to Israel and Zionism and anti-Zionism. And the reason for that is not because I think they're especially intertwined. I don't. It's because in contemporary politics, they are so often intertwined. And in contemporary discourse, they're so often intertwined. And I think it's useful for us to have a minute to talk about what exactly is the nature of that relationship and why is it so often conflated and how does it connect to the actual mythology of anti-Semitism. And if there's time, which there won't be, we can talk about the best ways to respond, or maybe during the Q&A. So generally speaking, scholars use the term anti-Semitism only to refer to modern anti-Semitism, to modern animosity, hostility towards Jews beginning in the late 1800s. Before that, they tend to avoid the term, not only because it was coined in the 1860s and 70s, but also because it has a kind of racial connotation which doesn't exist before the modern period for the most part. Pre-modern hatred of Jews begins 2,000 years ago, begins in the foundational texts of Christianity, which left its stamp on Christian European culture. I don't have time. As I said, if I had weeks, I could go through them all. But for example, you have the Gospel of John, which explicitly has Jesus calling Jews the children of Satan. You have church fathers like John Chrysostom, which explicitly calls Jews the children of Satan, and many, many other texts like it. So it literally demonizes the Jew, makes the Jews demon. And this expands in the iconography of the Middle Ages with mythology like Jews committing ritual murder, to taking the blood of a Christian, so reenacting deicide, right, which the New Testament accuses the Jews of collectively of deicide, and that collectivity is very important. And that's actually a central myth that we have to keep in the back of our head, that Jews are viewed in this mindset, in the anti-Semitic mindset, as a single collectivity. If you watch Star Trek: The Next Generation, which I do, then you might be familiar with the Borg, and you can think about that. Jews across time and across space are a single entity, which means that Jews are collectively responsible for the murder of God at the crucifixion of Christ. And this is reenacted in the mythology that evolves in Christian Europe over the centuries. So for example, blood libel, the idea that they have to kill a Christian for its blood for matzah. It goes without saying that none of these are actually true. I hope I don't have to repeat that. You have the idea of the host desecration, which is a remarkable myth actually in mythology, because the assumption is Jews would capture the transubstantiated wafer that has become the body of Christ in order to reenact the crucifixion of Christ. But in the image, you can see blood drips out of the wafer, which means to say Jews know that it actually is the body of Christ. They're not some sort of kid trying to get back at a religion which they don't believe in. In this idea, Jews believe in Christianity, but they're satanic. So of course, in other words, they see the blood come out. They know that it actually is the body of Christ, but they still want to do it. And you have many other images like Yud Sau, you have Jews interacting with a pig, and of course a pig because it's the classically non-kosher animal, suckling at its teats for milk, licking its anus, and connected to Satan all along. Now in the modern period, this changes and the mythology evolves and the way it works evolves. We're dealing not in the modern period with prejudice, with individual prejudice, but rather with an entire ideology, with a view of the entire world that focuses on this, a lens of the world. And it's not a mob going down some medieval street saying, let's get the Jews or get the Jew. It's the platform of a modern political party. This is the age of mass politics, and new parties organize themselves based on this worldview, that if we solve the Jewish problem, which could mean a variety of things, and often is left very vague on purpose, then we will solve all of our problems. It's not attitude, it's not religious disbelief really is the primary thing, although that continues. The Christian Jew hatred mythology will continue through the 20th century. First of all, there are ritual murder trials in Europe in the 1890s and 1900s, but even beyond that, you'll see it if you read, for example, Jan Gross's Neighbors, a famous book about the pogrom by Poles against Jews in Jedwabne during the Holocaust. He shows that there are many motivations by those who murdered Jews, including pre-modern Christian mythology that hasn't gone away. But overall, it's less religious disbelief and more about, and I'll show you some images to highlight this, international Jewish power, which is a new myth, and to this day, the dominant myth of anti-Semitism. Sometimes, often, it's about race, but not always. There are famous, I'm thinking of Treitschke, for example, who was not a racist. For them, if a Jew converted to Christianity, they were good, but that was increasingly rare. More and more, it was about race. And it was not just, as I write here, a general hatred, but it was directed towards social action. So when you see images like this, you won't see this in the Middle Ages. These are uniquely modern images, very often centering on Rothschild. Again, the idea, which is similar to the past, is that Jews constitute a single body, a single ontological being, and they need a representation. So often they would choose a famous wealthy Jew, which was Rothschild, very, very often the famous Jewish banking family. His name still sticks around. The family barely exists, but the name has that resonance. And I'll show you some examples of that shortly. Jew is the puppet master. And again, it could be a Jew with these exaggerated features as in this one, or it could be an actual Jew with or without exaggerated features. Very often today, as we'll see in a minute, the common sort of target of this worldview today is George Soros, because he supports liberal causes, because he's a billionaire. And it's interesting, by the way, we'll see in a second that Jews are accused of being both communists and capitalists, which is a funny thing. How can they be both? I'll explain that. But George Soros is both. He's both a communist liberal menace, but he's also a billionaire hedge fund manager. So which is he? Is he a billionaire menace or is he a communist? And you see here the image on the bottom left by Ben Garrison, who's a very popular right-wing American artist who has many anti-Semitic images that are still circulating in the press. This is one, right? You see George Soros as puppet master, and just for good measure above him, you see Rothschild with a reptilian hand controlling Soros, controlling, this is McMaster and the leadership of the American military. And this will continue, most famously through the protocols of the Elders of Zion, which is this forgery. I call it a forgery. It's a funny word, forgery, though, right? It's supposed to be the meeting of the Elders of Zion plotting to take over the world, but to call it a forgery suggests that there actually was a meeting and there are protocols, but this isn't it. This is a forgery. Obviously, there is no such thing as Elders of Zion meeting. If you've ever been to a traditional synagogue, the idea of organized anything is kind of a joke. But the idea is, again, that it's an ontological being. It's a conspiracy, right? It's a conspiracy. This was spread by the Fords in America. It was distributed at all of their dealerships. And it's interesting to think about what they're accused of. I mean, look at this list. I mean, it's funny. I mean, Darwinism, which by the way, got played just recently because Laura Logan, who used to be with 60 Minutes and is bizarrely on the back of the Father Despard's book. I couldn't believe that. But she is now spreading vicious anti-Semitic hatred, and she blamed Darwinism on the Rothschild, which is to say on collective Jews, just a couple weeks ago, which is just classic, real Nazi-level anti-Semitism, which is why I was so struck by the fact that she I guess she used to be respectable. I have no idea. It was very bizarre to see. But anyway, Darwinism, Marxism, Nietzscheism, freedom of speech, destruction of aristocracy, teaching human rights, immortality of kings, confusing the people by allowing different opinions to be aired, universal suffrage, parliamentary politics, liberalism, freedom of the press, progress, theater, the arts, the gold standard. What do these things have in common? How can Jews be communists and capitalists? And the answer is they're modern. They are the symbol of modernity and change. And that's what they represent, modernity and change, including racial change, as we'll see in a bit. So this is coming from the protocols and from modern anti-Semitism more generally. And I want to emphasize, by the way, that rhetoric matters. Historians know that it's quite famous, actually, among those of us who study this, that in the 1870s and 80s, there was a peak of anti-Semitic parties in Central Europe, Germany, Austria, and elsewhere, France, and they peaked. And then in the 1890s, the economy improved, and they lost their support. They became very minor movement. But what they did do was legitimate anti-Semitism as a political program. In other words, if you know the expression, the Overton window expanded to allow anti-Semitism in polite company, in political speech, right? I mean, we all know this phenomenon. You know, I'd like to believe that even in 2022, if a politician actually ever used the N-word, that their career would be over. I said this, by the way, to myself last night, but I literally read in the Washington Post today that a mayor in some city was recorded using the N-word and saying, we should string the blacks up, and then saying, but I didn't mean it. I mean, it's shocking to me if he survives, but I would have liked to have thought until literally 3 hours ago that would have been enough. But certainly we've all seen in the last 5-6 years, my God, you can get away with saying really horrific things and somehow your career doesn't get affected. But this is what happened with the rhetoric in anti-Semitism. So that in the 1920s and 30s, when new parties came along, like the Nazi Party, but not only, and they started speaking this way, nobody said that's not legitimate. You can't say that. You're out, right? They ignored it, or most people who voted for the Nazis did so despite the anti-Semitism, not because of it. They had lots of anti-Semitic parties to choose from. They chose that one for other reasons, but they were okay with the anti-Semitism, and that's a legacy of this. The legitimization of the rhetoric, the expansion of the Overton window. And I just want, if I had more time, I would talk about this point, which is that we've been having this for the whole week. I just want to point out one thing that I always do with the Holocaust. The Holocaust is not only a product of anti-Semitism, it's a product of the collapse of democracy. Fascism is about more than demonization of a minority, in this case, Jews. Fascism is about authoritarianism, cult of the leader, a celebration of violence, and many other characteristics. And you need both for the Holocaust. You need the collapse of democracy and the rise of the cult of leadership and violence, and you need the anti-Semitism, but that's for another day. Now, went the wrong direction, I'm sorry. What about race in America? So in America, and I'm not watching my time, so please stop me if I go over. In America, there's a big question today about Jews and race and Jews and whiteness and so on. It deserves also its own class. I will say, generally speaking, Jews in America who are not Jews of color. There are Jews of color, probably 10% of American Jews are Jews of color, so I'm not speaking of them, but other Jews who are not Jews of color benefited from whiteness in America for the most part. And this is not just a social issue, which it is that, but it's also a legal issue because race in America is in the legal code. Rules of misogyny, for example, Jim Crow segregation, et cetera, et cetera. Jews who are not Jews of color benefited from whiteness. But America socially and culturally wasn't always sure Jews were white. And so most famously from the late 1800s until after World War II, there was a lot of debate about Jews being white or not being white. You see this book, Hebrew Jokes, where you can see an image of a Jew who's got these sort of exaggerated grotesque features that are almost alike the way African Americans are portrayed with exaggerated grotesque features, right? Almost say Jews are black, they're not really white, we're not quite sure. There was a famous lynching of a Jew, nothing like what African Americans experienced. There was one, again, there's no comparison, but it happened, Leo Frank, and there was blocking of Jews along with African Americans from country clubs, swimming pools, neighborhoods. But I would say that by the 1950s, for other historical reasons, white Jews were considered white. No worries. No, it happens all the time to me as well. By the 1950s and 60s, white Jews were seen as white. They were seen as this famous book, Protestant Catholic Jew, to show that Jews were just like the Protestants, Catholics, right? The famous four ministers that sank with a Navy ship, two ministers, a priest and a Jew, right? We're all American, but of course, what they mean is we're all white American, but still we're all American. That was the idea. So Jews become normalized in that sense. But then how do we get to this? How do we get to Charlottesville, right? How do we get to a bunch of neo-Nazis and white nationalists going to Charlottesville, ostensibly because they were taking down a statue of Robert E. Lee, and they're screaming, Jews will not replace us. I mean, how many Jews are there that they're going to replace all the white people? That can't be what they meant, right? And it's not what they meant. What they meant was a theory that you mentioned, great white replacement theory. The idea is that whites are being replaced with non-whites, but the problem is if you're a racist, how can non-white people possibly arrange that? I mean, they're too inferior. They don't have the sensibility to do it. They're subhuman in the racist mindset. Where the Jews come along, the Jews are arranging. And this goes back to Hitler and even deeper than that, but certainly it's very big in America. Jews are the ones orchestrating this great white replacement because Jews constitute this international conspiracy trying to undermine national strength, which means white strength. Jews are not stupid. Again, there's a fine line between philo-Semitism and anti-Semitism, but calling Jews smart is usually anti-Semitic. First of all, you're collectivizing them and racializing them, but beyond that, it's not smart in a positive way. It's smart in a clever, nefarious way. And they're using their smarts and their power nefariously to undermine white hegemony. And this is not just these people in Charlottesville. This is normative. This is normative. It's everywhere. So free the press, George Soros, again, the puppet master, Donald Trump, who I will speak his name, saying George Soros is paying all these Black Lives Matter. Why would you imagine that George Soros is paying? Like, ask anyone who protested with Black Lives Matter, did they get a check? I'm skeptical, right? But why do you imagine that? I'm still waiting for my check. Because they're too stupid to organize themselves. That's the racist assumption here. So Jews, and specifically George Soros, representing Jews collectively. Here's Kevin McCarthy, the minority leader of the Congress, who will probably, unfortunately, be in November the majority leader. I know I'm recorded, but I have tenure, so I can say whatever I want. And here he writes, we cannot allow Soros, Steyer, and Bloomberg to buy the election, right? Why these three? I wonder, right? Rudy Giuliani, follow the money. I think Soros is the Antichrist. Here's a nice combination of modern anti-Semitism, money, and power, together with religious Antichrist, right? Giuliani once said, I'm a better Jew than Soros. He's not Jewish. Look at the dates here. I've been doing this week. This is this week. These are members of Congress. I mean, the former president, but these are members of Congress. The globalist cabal. I mean, this is, I don't think the dog whistle business the factory must have shut down and switched to bullhorns. Here's Laura Logan, who I mentioned earlier, right? Darwinism comes from the Rothschilds. Here's from Fox News. Fox News on the bottom right. This was on Fox News. You see, the Democrats and the Republicans, all of them controlled as puppet master by George Soros. Candace Owens, Zelensky is famously Jewish. So of course, he's part of the globalist cabal as well. He's a globalist. Globalist is just put the three parentheses, that the anti-Semites use for Jews. Wendy Rogers is here in Arizona. I picked her special for you here in Arizona. She stands with Christians, not the globalists, Zelenskys and Soroses, right? This isn't subtle. I think we're past the age of subtlety here. And by the way, it's foreign places as well. Iran did it as well. So did Erdogan in Turkey. But I'm interested in America right now. Robert Bowers, you mentioned in the Tree of Life massacre, he's hearing this stuff. And I cannot connect Robert Bowers to Donald Trump or to Kevin McCarthy. I can't. But isn't that what, we leave it to you guys to explain this, I'm getting it wrong, but isn't that what stochastic terror is, right? We can't make a one-to-one connection between any act of terror and the hate speech that instigates it. But I know that if somebody from a large bully pulpit like the White House or Tucker Carlson, who, if you didn't know, has the most popular program on cable news, if you call it news, but he has the most popular program. And if they keep spewing this stuff, we know people are going to act statistically. We don't know who, but we know it's going to happen. And Bowers certainly did that. Why does he kill these Jews? They're in the friggin' 80s. Why does he kill them? To stop the Latin American immigrants in the southern border? Oh, because Soros is doing it. And Soros and these Jews are the same being, like the Borg. You don't have to kill the mothership. You can kill any Borg. They're all the same. So you kill these people because they support immigrants, right? Now, why that? If we know the mythology here, the mythology is international Jewish conspiracy trying to undermine national sovereignty. How does Zionism come into it? And I would just point to, there is, by the way, debate among scholars between two different definitions. Right now, there's a third one out there as well. I helped write actually the third one, but these are the two that get the most press. There are good people behind both of them. I admit my bias. I have published articles saying that the second one, the Jerusalem one, is better. But there are good people behind. I encourage you to Google them and read the articles about them and decide for yourselves. But I would say sometimes anti-Semitism does appear as anti-Israel language. Sometimes it's a mask. It is. I'm a left-wing person, and I'll say it. It's true. But the key is to see, is there a Jewish global conspiracy being propagated? If you're making a statement about Israel, no matter what it is, even if it's wrong, even if it's unfair and biased, if it's about Israel as a state doing something, that's not anti-Semitic. That's a political statement. You might be wrong. You might be unfair. You might be spot on, but that's a political statement. If you're saying there's a conspiracy, if you could pop out the word Israel and pop in the word Rothschild, then that's not anti-Israel. I don't even think you should say it's crossed the line. It's not crossing the line. It's a completely different phenomenon. That's anti-Semitism. If you say Israel is responsible for Russia invading Ukraine, that's anti-Semitism. That's not a criticism of Israel. That's a conspiratorial theory of world Jewish power, and Israel is replacing Rothschild or Soros. If you say Israel is responsible for climate change, or anything like that. And I think that's the key, right? Or likewise, equally, if Jews, because they're Jews, are responsible for Israel, that's anti-Semitism. Even if they are Zionists. And I note here, by the way, that most Zionists, and I've studied this for 30 years now, don't know anything about what's happening in Israel or Palestine. For them, Zionism is a form of religious identity. It's a way of saying, I'm proudly Jewish. They know nothing. I talk to them. People don't know. I have students come to my class wearing big IDF, Israel Defense Force t-shirts. And I don't want to embarrass them, but they know nothing about the IDF. And they're not trying to convince anyone to support the IDF. They're not sending care packages. They're trying to say, I look just like you, and I eat just like you, and I talk just like you, but I'm Jewish, and I'm proud, and I want you to know it. That's the extent of it. And we have to remember that. And equally, Jews remember that anti-Zionism is often not about Israel either. It's a kind of, Zionism is experienced very differently by Palestinians and those who support them. And you have to remember that as well. So I think this is a very important part of the story. And by the way, I'll end with this, because I must be out of time, that Zionism can also go with anti-Semitism. This is John Hagee, who's the head of the Christians United for Israel, a pro-Israel group, allegedly, right? They send hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel all the time, mostly to the settlements, of course. He is a raving anti-Semite. I've called him that in the press. I'll say it here publicly. He's also, by the way, a terrible Islamophobe, but he's a raving, he talks about the Rothschild conspiracy to undermine the US dollar. He is an anti-Semite, but for him and his vision, people say, well, who cares if he wants Jesus to come and he thinks Jews will convert? I care, because he's propagating anti-Semitism. And by the way, trying to put Israel into war with Iran to make an Armageddon because he thinks that will bring Christ. So I think there actually are Jewish lives at stake, even if you don't believe in his vision. But he is an anti-Semite. And by the way, Viktor Orban as well. Very well-known anti-Semite. When he just won re-election a few days ago, and he said, we beat George Soros and the international left. I mean, it's out of a Nazi playbook, right? It's out of the protocols of the Elders of Zion. But here he is with the former prime minister of Israel, Netanyahu. Why? Because he's pro-Israel. He supports the settlements because he views Jews, he hates Muslims more than he hates Jews. But he's an anti-Semite and he's a Zionist. So I think we have to remember that as well. It's complicated. And again, I'll leave you with the point that if we know the mythology of anti-Semitism, if we know what it's actually about, then we can understand when and where it may or may not intersect with issues of Israel and Zionism. And I think people talk about that much too much. And it doesn't mean it doesn't happen, it does. But I think that it's much more often something else going on. Thanks.
Thank you. If I could ask each of the panelists to join up here at the table, I would appreciate it. Volker, oh, there's the microphone. I was going to ask for that. You continue to impress with the logistical demands. I've been going to academic conferences for over 35 years, been on a ton of panels like this, chaired a lot of panels like this. People never stay to the time. They all stayed to the time. It was all great. I mean, I'm kind of thunderstruck right now. This just doesn't happen that people are that courteous. But I want to thank each of the panelists because I know it's so difficult to take the work that you're so passionate about and have done so much great work in and distill it to a brief 15-minute window for us. But I want to thank each of you for being willing to do that. I'm going to start by asking the panelists to speak among themselves for a moment. Just take a minute or two, each of them. What thoughts were they struck by as they heard the other panelists speak that tied to their work or maybe made them think differently about their work or their presentation? We'll start, whoever has, Ronette, you have a microphone in front of you. you want to start with a minute or two of reflection? Then we'll go to the other two panelists, then we'll open up to questions from you.
I mean, both of these panelists that I'm honored to.
Turn it on.
Testing. Okay. Both of these panelists, I'm just honored to be here. I mean, I think yours was so heartfelt, and I was struck by, and when I worked at the Justice Department, I presented at a lot of conferences where there are FBI detectives. And I'm always struck by hearing you said the word visceral, but you have a visceral passion about helping people, and your goal is to try to get people to come to you to combat this. And that was extremely hopeful for me. That was extremely hopeful for me, and I need hope in my life. And this was unbelievable. I mean, I have read many papers and books on anti-Semitism and all the mythology and the propaganda with cartoons. In fact, Alex and I are working on a project tracing cartoons from Nazi Germany newspapers, but I've never seen it all put together and tracing that with racism and the connection. And it was just brilliant. So yeah, I love to learn. So this was just unbelievable. So.
Thank you, Ronette.
Thanks. Yeah, I just want to say again, there was tough acts to follow. That was really impressive, and I learned a lot. And particularly, again, I'll also echo what Ronette said, that the passion there is very inspiring. I'll offer just a couple questions or thoughts that maybe might come up from the audience as well that you can respond to or not. One of them is when we talk about anti-Semitism, I always ask myself, especially when we use the ADL, and I have many friends at the ADL. I support the ADL. I'm also very frustrated by the ADL very often, particularly Jonathan. But I will say that when people talk about anti-Semitism, I always want to ask, what does that mean? People report anti-Semitism, because I know people report things that are often not anti-Semitism. And I'm not doubting people as victims per se, but people say there was this Palestinian protest at the Union talking about Israel committing war crimes. That's not anti-Semitism. That's just challenging what they thought about Israel. And it's very painful to be challenged, having been raised a certain way. On the right, I can tell you it is painful. It's painful being confronted with ideas that may be right, that maybe touch a nerve, may be wrong, but you're upset that they're saying them. But it's not anti-Semitism. And I wonder to myself how often I wish when the ADL gave these statistics, and especially wish when the newspapers covered them, that they would break it down and say, this was graffiti, which is clearly anti-Semitism. This was an attack, which is clearly anti-Semitism. This was a swastika or something like that. This was a Palestinian demonstration. This was Palestinians saying, Israel, this was an apartheid week, right? I wish it would distinguish between those so that I would know what's actually going on. So that's one comment. And the other is, and I plead ignorance on this one, the whole hate crime thing I'm always confused about, because I know there are good people who, and you didn't speak about this because of course you only had 15 minutes, but who question the whole categorization of hate crime. In other words, crime's a crime. And if I did it because I want your wallet, or because I don't like Black people, or because I'm homophobic, or whatever it is, or because I'm violent and I just want to hurt somebody. I've heard people question why we distinguish in the intent in that way and make it worse. And I've heard answers to it as well, but I wonder if it's worth some reflection, thinking about why, just saying it, why is it important to have these laws? We all obviously want to stop hatred and the crimes that come from it, but why it's so important, for example, in the murder of Arbery, that the 3 men who are already going to spend the rest of their lives in jail, why it's important that there be a new trial and they be convicted of hate crime or any other crime for that, any other thing that's happened besides that case, which was so shocking. So just a thought. Yeah, please. Yeah.
And I think you can answer that too very well, because the foundation, I mean, it's sort of just like the drug crimes and crimes perpetrated with a firearm. The enhanced sentences send a message not only to offenders, but to would-be offenders. If I do this, I'm going to get an enhanced sentence, or I could also be tried at the federal level. And so it's a deterrent, supposedly, and it's also a message to society that we think this is wrong and deserves enhanced sentences, even if you're going to prison for life.
Thank you. We'll hear from Dan and then open it up for questions from in-person and virtual. Dan?
there are so many wonderful things to respond to. First, thank you. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to share the panel with you. I appreciate it. Thank you. I am a lifelong student, and I feel like I learned much from both of you. And I would love to see your 4-hour, the much longer presentation. Given that I want to work backwards from hate crimes, we in the FBI say that hate crimes are message crimes, and they're intended by the perpetrators to target and to hurt not just the immediate victim of the crime, but the entire community. The victim is the representative of the community, and they're hurting the entire community. And when we're connected as we are socially across the internet, however you want to describe that connection, you're attacking a much, much larger community, which feels it right away. Currently, our ability to prosecute hate crimes gives us a way to provide recourse to the community writ large, rather than simply to the, I don't want to minimize this, but rather than only to the immediate victim. The entire community can feel the effects of justice if that crime is recognized as a crime against the group rather than just the immediate victim. And if that justice is found by that way, they can feel vindicated. But if you look back in the history of our hate crime statutes too, we have put these hate crimes in place federally because we have failed locally and at the state level to provide justice to the minimized. This is why we initially, as a people, as the United States people, wrote and codified hate crimes. More and more we recognize the other effects of it, but as a United States people, we are a little bit different that way. We can't rest on that difference. It's not a permanent difference. And Director Mueller actually said that, I think 15 years ago, that we have this interesting balance we have to strike between security from crime, security from terrorist attack, and civil liberties. And if we give up our civil liberties to be sure of our security, we lose. If we give up our security to be sure of our civil liberties, we lose. And how we balance that is something that we as a people have to work out, thankfully, day by day. Stop.
Oh, that's great. Thank you. Thank you, Owen. It strikes me as we entered the hate crime discussion, this is what we often talk about in genocide studies, that the targeting of individuals in genocide cares nothing about the individual characteristics of a person. It's done simply on your group identity, even if you don't think you have that group identity. I spoke to Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims in the former Yugoslavia, who said, yeah, when the crisis started, we got the knock on the door saying we were being deported or we being moved elsewhere because we're Muslim. And we said, we're not Muslim. It's never been our group identity. But what mattered was the perpetrator's definition. In the perpetrator's eyes, they were Bosniak, they were Muslim, and that's what mattered. So it is nothing to do with an individual characteristic. It is removing all the beautiful things that make up the complexity of your identity and just saying you're this one thing and you're this one thing only. And that's why the destruction is going to be visited on you. We now have time for questions. In your question, it would be very helpful if you are directing it specifically to one or two panelists to indicate that. If it's a question for all the panelists to open up to responses, that would be appreciated as well.
Sorry, it's kind of for anybody who can answer it, but I read research that said that people are more likely to behave badly if they, one, do not fear that they're going to get caught, that there's a very low likelihood of them getting caught, and two, that they'll be prosecuted and or receive a painful, punishment. Is there anything that you can see, a way of increasing the likelihood that they're caught and the likelihood that they'll receive a painful response so that we can prevent this kind of thing in the future by using those folks as examples?
I'll take a very brief attempt and then I'll pass the mic to someone else. But there are so many things that we can do, that we can, as Americans, we like to buy things and you look to technology as a way to mitigate our problems. You know, we put up thousands and thousands of cameras and we can monitor our activities throughout the day. But really and truly, the one thing that we can do is we can know more people and know them better. And if we know our neighbors, then our neighbors can watch out for us. If we know the people down the street and we have a real community around us, then as a community, we can draw strength from each other. It's a very easy way to try to encapsulate a challenging problem. But think of how few people in your neighborhood know each other. I was in a local town not that long ago, looking into a hate crime. And it turned out that when one family moved in, they had a housewarming party to bring the neighborhood in to meet the neighborhood. And that was the first time residents of the neighborhood who had lived there for 18 years had ever met each other. And if you live in such an isolated way, then you can feel more confident in striking at the stranger, the other, because you don't know them. And you feel then that person is with an isolated target. Groups are stronger. It would be nice if we as Americans had a group of Americans.
I do believe that the CJ system operates as a deterrent, but it takes, there are three elements of deterrence theory that have to take place, and you named all three of them. One is certainty, right? One is swiftness, and the final is severity. Research shows severity is not the important one, it's certainty. Because if you don't believe you're going to get caught, who cares that the punishment is going to be severe? There's no likelihood that's going to be implemented because you're not going to be caught. So I do believe, and this has been shown time and time again, the Me Too movement, police officers finally being held accountable for unnecessary killings. And now 3 hateful murderers held responsible at the federal level for hate crimes. These, I do believe, trickle down to perceptions of certainty. And that's my belief. Empirical evidence is not there yet, but
I have no idea if deterrence works. I'm learning from you, but I will say that it seems to me, in terms of how to respond and building on what you said, Dan, is two things. First of all, I think we need to remind ourselves, and having lived as a Hasidic person in Austria for a year, I can tell you that this happened more than once, that when someone is being rhetorically attacked, obviously when someone's being violently attacked, people tend to stand up, although I've seen videos where they don't, but rhetorically attacked, often not, especially in big cities like New York. And I think the importance people feel, I can tell you, as when I was living in Vienna, if I was being rhetorical, I was never physically attacked ever, but I was certainly rhetorically attacked, and it made a difference when someone said, "What the hell are you doing? Shut up," and then said, "Are you okay?" etc. But I will say, what's even harder than that, in my experience, is when you're alone with people in your in-group and you hear things. And the importance of speaking up then, which comes with social cost. It comes with real social costs for all of us, anyone who does it. If you're in a group of people who feel comfortable saying things that are terrible, you will face cost if you say that's wrong. You shouldn't say that. This is wrong for X or Y, Z. You will face cost, but it has to be done. Whether it's a joke, whether it's real awful things, worse than jokes, it's very, very important in my experience.
So you touched a little bit on it when you just spoke, but I was just wondering if you guys could speak on the usage of like speech and words in hate crimes, like especially right now, it falls in line very well with what's happening on ASU's campus because Sister Cindy is here and she's a well-known evangelicalist preacher who is no victim or to hate speech. And in the historical cases like Brandenburg v. Ohio, hate speech is very prevalent. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that with hate crimes and how to prevent it and what falls in line there.
Everyone punted on that to me. And I am stuck telling you that the FBI doesn't recognize such a thing as hate speech. Speech is not something that is criminalized until it becomes a threat. However, I say, however, I don't have tenure. However, all of that speech helps us show bias, helps us show motivation, helps us show then the hatred that underpins the crime. Someone can say vile things in the public square, and that is not going to be a federal crime. But those vile things, whether said publicly, tweeted, texted, emailed, what have you, can help us show then the motivation and the bias to prove the hate crime. And this is one way that our statutes are unique from most state and local statutes. If someone is arrested, if someone commits murder and is arrested for that murder, you can try to show the motive, but you may not have the ability to go back into 10 years of online communication. You may not have cause to go 10 years of online communication to show the motive for that act. However, under our federal statutes, we can demonstrate the need to go back and show the universe of communications that demonstrate the bias. The things we say online last forever. Tell your kids. I don't know if that addressed your question, because I know that ASU is dealing with things currently and has been for years, honestly, about speech and about hate. And I'd be happy to talk with you more after. I have business cards for anyone who wants a business card. I give out thousands of business cards. I only have 4 crazy people who call me. And I say crazy because they send me Fox News. And they tell me you should do something about this. I said, what? I mean, this is not breaking intel. This is Fox News. We have a hand in the back.
Yeah, I've got a couple of questions from the online attendees. The first one from, I believe this is for the two of you on the left side. Do we know statistically how often perpetrators commit hate crimes against strangers versus acquaintances or friends?
Yes, we do. And usually it's against strangers, although surprisingly, there are victimizations against known victims. But the majority, just like the majority of robberies are perpetrated by strangers, there's still a non-trivial percentage that are perpetrated by known offenders. So does that answer the question?
In my opinion, but it wasn't my, I think so. The second one, do any of you see the importance of focusing and prosecuting based on hate crimes because it is an organized motive? Do you see hate as an organized motive for crimes? That's all that's in the question. So I don't have anything else for context.
Right. I don't think any of us are truly clear on how to address that, but hate as a motive for crime, we certainly do see that. We see that most grossly in our active shooter cases, our attacks on collective groups, on attacks on houses of worship. And in that case, I think you can make the argument that it is the organizing motive for the crime. But I don't think we have enough data, perhaps, on hate crimes in general, and we certainly don't have enough precision in the data on hate crimes. I have most of the same concerns with our UCR and NIBRS information that Ronette has. So I don't think we can say in general that hate is an organizing component to crime, but certainly does appear in some crimes that way. And I apologize to our virtual viewer for the struggle to answer that question.
Thank you. We have another question from the audience, and then I have two questions I want to jump in with as well, but please.
This is to, is it Dr. Shanes? Okay. I'm an American Jew, secular for the most part, a proud Zionist. And I have to say, as an American Jew, there's some things I take issue with in your presentation. Because as you know, there's only 15 million of us worldwide due to incessant pogroms and attacks. But you get two Jewish people in one room and we don't always agree. So there's some things that disturb me, and that is you don't hear Irish Americans or Italian Americans saying they benefited from white privilege. And I feel strongly as an American Jew that I probably look more ethnic, I don't know. I don't feel I totally benefited from white privilege, and I've experienced anti-Semitism many times. And so I really take some consternation with that. I'm sorry. The other part that I wish to share is pro-Palestinian rallies that I wish you to include perhaps down the road in your presentations. That is fine. However, there are many instances where there are blatant anti-Semitism issues against Jewish students on campus, you know, where they get signs on their doors saying, you will be evicted from your dorm room tomorrow. You know, and I wish you would draw attention to people during your presentation about that, because that's affecting American Jews. I'm sorry. And then one other thing I want to say is that just to draw attention to this, because I've recently gone to the Capitol and I presented against BDS. Okay. And so one issue that I've learned of, and I was confronted by a small group of students and they kept yelling at me, you're gaslighting, like, hello, I'm just one Jew trying to talk. You know, this was outside. I'm not gaslighting you. I'm trying to educate you. I'm trying to talk to you. But they wouldn't let me talk. And so to be fair, the Palestinian young lady, she was awesome and she let me talk. But other people were just yelling at me. One thing I wish to share is that also, and I'm sorry, is that the youth these days, there's a rallying cry for President Obama to really press the Saudi Arabians on the death and horrible murder of Jamal Khashoggi, okay? But through my lens that I have learned also, Jamal Khashoggi spread a lot of anti-Semitism in his tweets. And unless you're reading about all this, you don't know it. And so I wonder if the poisonous threat of anti-Semitism and the call for justice for Jamal Khashoggi, which is totally legitimate, but no one mentions the anti-Semitism that he is guilty of spreading through the Arab countries against Jewish people, against Israelis that suffer horrible anti-Semitism. And I just wonder, the youth seem very ignorant of it, but groups like the Justice Democrats, they're not ignorant of the anti-Semitic words of Jamal Khashoggi. And so those are my statements. I apologize.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I know it's difficult. That was a lot for me to respond to, and I didn't take notes like I should have.
Sorry.
So I'll try to remember all the comments. You said President Obama, I assume you mean President Biden, by the way. So a few things. So first of all, and this is in no particular order, but just what pops in my scatterbrain head. In terms of the students, I did say, I was clear about that, and I agree with you. If you attack students, and I say attack, obviously any violent attack is unacceptable, but if you rhetorically speak to a Jewish student, let's say by putting something on his dormitory door, as you said, or by a Jewish candidate for student government saying, well, you're Jewish, so you have to speak about what you think about Israel, that's anti-Semitic. That's not anti-Israel. And I think we have to have a categorical difference between these phenomenon. phenomena. These are two different things, and I agree with you. And I mentioned it that it's actually in the PowerPoint, so I agree with you completely. As to the issue of what Democracy, I'm not an expert on, but I mean, I think the point there is I don't understand journalism myself very well, but I gather that when somebody is assassinated by a foreign government who's an ally of the United States, whether they were a racist or anti-Semite becomes less relevant than the fact that they were assassinated as a journalist by an ally of the United States, and that becomes the story. I'm guessing, if I had to guess on that. As to the whiteness, there are people in this conference that are much more knowledgeable than me on the history of systemic racism in America. I know something about Jewish history in America. I myself, not because I'm Jewish or religious, but just because I study it and teach it for a living. Jews, people who are white in the sense of systemic discrimination in America, often face other kinds of discrimination. White women couldn't vote until quite late, and have other kinds of discrimination to this day, and certainly into the 1960s. Jews obviously face anti-Semitism, which manifests in lots of different ways. Glass ceilings at businesses, universities that had limits of how many Jews could attend, things like that, and other things as well. The comment I was making is that, and Italians and Irish in different points in American history had their own levels of discrimination. I don't think it persisted as long as anti-Semitism, but it was there. But none of this compares to the Black experience in America, just nothing. And I don't mean only because of the level of discrimination, but the systemic nature of it. Jews were never redlined. The impact of redlining on African Americans persists to this day. African Americans could not build middle-class wealth in the 20th century because they couldn't get mortgages, and Jews could. Jews were banned from some neighborhoods, but they could buy in other neighborhoods and get mortgages, and often African Americans could not. The GI Bill, when the civil service opened in the 20th century and had massive hires of new bureaucrats and whatnot, Jews couldn't get hired. African Americans couldn't get hired in the civil service, and Jews could. Jews got the GI Bill, which was designed for white people, and African Americans often couldn't get on the GI Bill, couldn't get into a college at all that would take it. And I could go on and on and on and on and on and on. There's simply no comparison to the Jewish experience. Jews benefited from whiteness in America in countless ways, in South and North from the beginning. They were equal under the eyes of the law and had all of the social and economic and political benefits of being white. And again, I'm speaking specifically of Jews who are not Jews of color, because there are Jews of color. And I don't mean because Jews' whiteness is questioned. I mean Jews who present as not being white. African-American Jews, some Jews from the Arab world who have dark skin, things like that. Yes, there's anti-Semitism to this day. My synagogue has full-time security. Most synagogues have full-time security, and I'm glad they do. I'm also glad that we don't allow anyone else to carry a gun. That's a different conversation. But they have full-time security, and I'm glad they do. Anti-Semitism persists. It's a threat. I'm more threatened now than I was when I was a kid. But it's just no comparison. The kind of privilege I have as a white person, it manifests in so many ways. And not just my own privilege, but the fact that my parents and grandparents had that privilege. The fact that my grandparents came from nothing and built up middle-class wealth by owning a home and business, something that anyone in Chicago in the 1920s and 30s couldn't have done in the same way if they didn't have white skin. I don't want to belabor the point, but I think it's very important to remember that even with anti-Semitism, there's intersectionality. And even with anti-Semitism, it's not the same. And I think that's an important thing to remember. But again, not to undermine the issue of all the anti-Semitism out there. You had one other point, but I apologize. I can't remember what the last one was, but I hope that responded to some of what you said anyway. And thank you for sharing, by the way.
Thank you. Thank you for the questions. I have two questions I want to follow up with, and then any final questions we have from the audience. To connect to hate speech, one of the things that has come up in genocide studies is that when we look at red flags, hate speech is always tricky because it's so often tied to hate crimes. As Dan said, it's often tied to, does the behavior itself actually occur? And there's been some movement towards some scholars thinking about, instead of hate speech, speaking about harmful speech, speech that does social harm. It doesn't have that high bar of hate speech, but it's speech that disrupts the social fabric. It does social harm to us. Do you see any promise in thinking about hate speech in a different way in that regard, or does it minimize it too much?
And I don't mean to be trite at all. I think academics are always coming up with new categories of things. and labeling them. I'm very much a First Amendment proponent. And but I do see the intent behind doing that. It is to talk about the harmful nature of speech that may not be able to be prosecuted or denied given our First Amendment, but is nevertheless harmful. And I think that is important.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
I know that other nations have criminalized certain uses of speech. They have laws in place that allow the arrest and prosecution of people for using certain words, certain phrases. And I don't know empirically what the efficacy of that is. I don't know if that mitigates the harm of such speech, or if it sensationalizes it. I don't know. I don't know if we've had enough international studies of that to be able to say. I think that regardless of how we cut it, there is speech that is harmful. There is speech that exacerbates and makes more permanent our division, and we should combat that. But I know we have also many, many ways to combat it. And I do not think that the criminal justice system is the way to do so.
Thank you. Josh.
Three very short responses. First of all, we have Volker in the room and others who can probably tell us of the efficacy of, for example, the criminalization of Holocaust denial in post-war Germany. I'd love to hear about that if he knows, if he can. Second of all, and this is the last thing I meant to say to the question I had, the author of the IRA definition, which is not the definition I like for various reasons, even though I like him very much, is a guy named Kenneth Stern. One thing he and I share is that he's very concerned with the criminalization of speech. He said, I wrote this definition of anti-Semitism not to criminalize something that may or may not be anti-Semitic, but to give us a data collection device with the biggest possible net. And he has written and testified in front of the Congress many times to try to get these not to have laws that criminalize speech. And I agree with him. And there's a book he wrote that I recommend strongly called The Crisis About the Crisis, which is a clever title. And the first chapter is about hate studies, which is a field I knew nothing about until I read it, which is great. And then the rest of it is this sort of paean to academic freedom, that we have to have freedom of speech, to let you should be able to speak, and those who are shouting it, you should be able to speak, and everyone should speak. However, and I agree with that completely, the justice system is not the place to shut that down, nor is the academic market. The academy should be allowing this speech. If Ben Shapiro came to my campus, I would not try to stop him from coming. I would probably support those who are saying he's saying terrible things, but he should be able to speak if there was a need for it. However, having said that, there's difference between criminalizing something and having social consequences for something. And I do think that if a politician, for example, says certain things, people are so now afraid of being canceling, of being part of cancel culture, that they're overdoing it. And they're not remembering that it's okay to give somebody social consequences. If somebody says something that is truly racist, anti-Semitic, they should be pressured to resign or not be reelected at least, or not be given committee assignments or whatever it may be. If they're a media personality, perhaps that station no longer wants to be affiliated with that person because they're promoting racism or anti-Semitism. And again, I'm not suggesting it should be immediate knee-jerk, you said one thing, immediately no discussion, they're gone. But surely we can, as a society, have some sense of an Overton window that you have gone outside the bounds of what we consider appropriate or acceptable. You know, there may be a gray area. There is a gray area of every subject, but there's also something beyond the gray area of every subject. And when that happens, I think we have to be willing to say, that's not illegal, but I have no reason that I want you to be in office anymore if that's how you're speaking. Just a thought.
Oh, thank you. Josh, let me, I'm sorry.
I would like to hear from Volker about the efficacy of criminalizing.
I'm so sorry to put in the spot. If you don't know, it's fine.
No, happy to respond. The interesting thing is, so these laws are not very effective, right? You ban the swastika, there's tons of Nazi symbols, and in some shape or form, they come back. You make sure that you can't publish Mein Kampf, well, then a Swiss publishing house is happy to oblige and you can get it. So in this sense, it's totally inefficient. In another sense, however, it is very efficient, I would argue, because it draws a line, it communicates to all people of goodwill that this is not tolerable, that we as a society stand for different things, and we're trying to draw a line in the sand. So in this sense, it's a mixed bag. There are clearly issues with infringing on First Amendment right. So here's the state that's trying to police speech, albeit for good purposes. It's not very efficient, right? This speech is there and it just morphs in another form, but it also communicates to us of who we want to be as a society, even not all of us are.
Thank you. That's helpful. We're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. Josh, I want to ask you quickly. I'm going to connect your concerns about the IRA definition to your time in Vienna. I was in Vienna this past November speaking at a conference on combating anti-Semitism in European football, soccer. And it was hosted by the oldest Viennese soccer club, which is a Jewish soccer club. And the day began with a pomp and circumstance ceremony of the adoption of the IRA definition of anti-Semitism. And all the mayor of Vienna was there. It drew tons of people out for it. And my sense is that definition has gained a ton of traction across Europe. Could you just very briefly, what is your significant concern with that definition? Because I know it is a point of contention and you've mentioned it a couple of times. So just briefly.
Yeah, it is, and it's hard to do it briefly. I will say, if you Google my name, I've written about it for Slate Magazine, and Derek Pensler has written about it in the foreword and many other articles. There are also very good people who defend IRA. The main concern about IRA, there are a couple aspects of its language. First of all, it's very vague. It says, for example, it may appear as a certain perception of Jews. What does that mean exactly? It's completely vague. It has concepts, if you call Israel racist, then that's anti-Semitic. Well, what if Israel is doing something racist? You can't say it, you're anti-Semitic. It has notions of, it's not clear when is criticism of Israel, when is that racist and when is that anti-Semitic and when is it not? It's completely unclear. And it's very focused on Israel. And the truth is, I'll let you in on a secret. The vast majority of scholars of anti-Semitism, we pretty much know what it is. It all comes down to Israel. I mean, it really does. If you actually talk to people, we all know what it is. And the question is, what about Israel? And in my experience, I've noticed that defenders of IRA tend to be more inclined to suppress pro-Palestinian perspectives as anti-Semitic. And defenders of the Jerusalem Declaration tend to try to separate from political speech and anti-Semitic speech along the lines that I sort of outlined, which is, this is sort of I came up with this, not in the Jerusalem Declaration. So if it has flaws, it's on me alone. But if you pop out Israel and you could pop in George Soros or you could pop in Rothschild, then that's anti-Semitism. And otherwise, it's just speech and it could be wrong. It's very problematic. And if, for example, by the way, it says, what if you say Jews are not a nation? Is that anti-Semitic? Well, first of all, lots of Jews don't think so. Jews have no idea what the hell they are. And they're all, as she said, 2 Jews, 5 opinions. None of us know. We've been arguing about it for 200 years. We don't know what we are. And why is picking one version of Jewishness anti-Semitic and the other version that's the proper version? Who says? And there's other issues as well. So I think the Jerusalem Declaration, in my opinion, and again, it's only an opinion, I think tends to correct some of these things, but there are perfectly wonderful scholars on both sides. And so I encourage everyone to read both definitions and Google various articles to see the arguments for and against them.
Yeah, and unfortunately, we've also seen in some white nationalist circles that the controversy between definitions of anti-Semitism have led to some extremists to say it must not exist.
Yeah.
If it can't be defined, then maybe it's not a deal. So that's something
I agree with you there too.
I want to finish by giving each panelist 1 minute. One of the mantras I have when I work with students in advising is every story has the room for a better ending. You may be failing this class, you're struggling, but every story has a room for a better ending. To finish us off, what's this story? What's our room for a better ending with this story going forward of trying to reduce anti-Semitism, bigotry, and hatred? Where do you see the hope for us? And then we'll call it to a close.
I'm holding the mic. I would rather have gone last, but I will say, yeah, please.
Mostly because if you go first, the bar is much lower. How do we improve this? What's the way to get to a better story? I think I am afraid I'm a bit of a one-trick pony this way. The way, in my mind, to get to a better story is if we stop staying where we're comfortable. Just we as people, we choose every day to be brave, and we connect with someone who is not known to us, not familiar to us, different from us in some way, not online, but someone that you've not talked to. Stand up for someone that you don't know. Stand up for someone who's being belittled in your circles. Do something brave. If we did that, we would live in a better country. I think that it is to combat that slow drip of the erosion that we see in our country. If we put our energy into slowly doing better things, we can make a difference.
So much for the no high bar.
Yeah, no kidding.
I'm just going to give a little anecdotal story. And I've been one of those who calls out, ism jokes or hate speech. And I've done it since my son was a toddler, and he's grown up his whole life, his mom calling out his friends because they say stuff in cars like they don't think you're there. And so I was talking to him when he was about 9 years old about, you don't stereotype people. You don't, blah, blah. He goes, well, Mom, you do. And I said, I do not. And this was there was an election going on. I think it was George W. And he goes, Mom, you stereotype all Republicans. And I'm like, oh my gosh. So I think that dovetails with, being the best you can be with kindness for everybody.
I should have gone first. Damn it. I'll just I'll say a couple of things. First of all, I echo be brave and be prepared to pay price because you will. I paid a price. I operate in Orthodox circles. This is the subject of my current research. Orthodox Jews in America are unlike the rest of the Jews, which are incredibly, bizarrely progressive and liberal. 90% of non-Orthodox Jews voted for Biden in the last election. The Orthodox Jews are the opposite. Orthodox Jews, for reasons I'm investigating, are aligned with white evangelicals and are very, very right-wing. And I don't get a lot of invitations. I don't get invited places. I pay a price. I might be tenured, but that doesn't make people be like me. So I'd say echo that. And I would also say the idea that, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me that's just ridiculous. First of all, words hurt. They do hurt. And second of all, they lead to other things. Rhetoric leads to action. And I think we need to take words seriously, whether they're words in our social circles that we need to respond to, whether they're words in the street when we see someone else being attacked, or whether they're the words of media personalities and politicians that need to be taken very seriously, not ignored. If history has taught us anything, it's that people mean things. Trust people when they say things. Trust people when they say things. That's my takeaway from history.
Thank you. This is a reminder, and the panel's work is a reminder that silence always favors a perpetrator. So we are here, you're here, you're part of that better ending to this story. So thank you for being here. Please join me in thanking the panelists for their contributions here as well.